Dear friends, the thematic report I have presented this year to the Human Rights Council in Geneva focuses on indigenous peoples who, being the original peoples in islands and continents, are marginalized and mistreated in their own territories. However, despite having suffered centuries of colonization and violence, they have kept alive worldviews and ancestral knowledge and practices that today are proving to be wise and applicable to the great challenge of sustainability and democratic governance that we face with the global water crisis that climate change will aggravate. For indigenous peoples, water is the blue soul of life. From the deep respect for nature that their worldviews inspire, indigenous peoples often treat aquatic ecosystems as sacred spaces, offering a genuine vision of the sustainability paradigm, as well as a holistic approach to the management of rivers, wetlands, and lakes integrated into their territories in full coherence with the ecosystem management approach. We need to preserve the sustainability of rivers and aquifers worldwide. On the other hand, the community management of water as a common good and not as a commodity offers an example of democratic governance, leaving no one behind, in line with human rights approach promoted by the UN. In any case, water and sanitation problems, far from being solved for indigenous peoples, are growing. In addition to the traditional gap in water and sanitation investments and infrastructure suffered by indigenous peoples, there is now a proliferation of mega projects in their territories that jeopardize the sustainability of their aquatic ecosystem and their human rights to safe drinking water and sanitation. Open pit mining not only destroys their territories, springs, rivers, and aquifers, but also poisons their water with toxic waste. The construction of large hydraulic dams floods inhabited valleys and areas vital to their survival. Land and water grabbing in their territories is on the increase for large agro-livestock developments that often pollute their waters also. Under the argument of environmental protection to develop tourism, displacements and restrictions are imposed on indigenous peoples in their own territories when biodiversity and ecosystems have been preserved, by the way, for hundreds of years, precisely thanks to them. Many countries avoid recognizing their own indigenous peoples under arguments of national unity and citizen equality, which, far from strengthening democracy and equity, puts the survival of these peoples at risk. In many other countries that do formally recognize their indigenous peoples, their right to prior, free, and well-informed consultation is often relegated under the fallacious arguments of national sovereignty over natural resources and water, or the defense of the general interests of the nation, in order to prioritize the interests of large corporations over the human rights of indigenous and non-indigenous peoples. Governments and companies often also criminalize peoples who oppose these projects with threats, violence, and even the murder of indigenous leaders, as happened, in fact, to my dear friend Berta Cáceres in Honduras. Guaranteeing the human rights of indigenous peoples requires also respecting their right to control and manage their waters in their territories, as well as their equal participation with non-indigenous populations in the management of watershed, basins, and aquifers that extend beyond the boundaries of their territories. States must provide indigenous authorities with the necessary means to guarantee the human rights to safe drinking water and sanitation to their populations, at least partially covering the historical debt that weighs on these peoples. pretexting the scarcity of public funds by prioritizing the growth of military spending, for instance, in the new arms race in the way over human rights is just not acceptable. We must strengthen UN capacities to effectively monitor compliance with the right to prior consent of indigenous peoples through free, prior, and informed consultation processes. Intercultural dialogue based on respect for their worldviews, knowledge, and ancestral practices should govern the development of education and training programs in indigenous languages, as well as active collaboration to develop and publish data on their water and sanitation situation. National legislation should also be promoted that allows for the control of companies from their own countries of origin when they operate in indigenous territories of third countries. Governments and indigenous peoples themselves have an obligation to promote women's participation in decision-making on water and sanitation, including menstrual hygiene, not only for reasons of justice, but also as a way to improve the management of these services by building on women's experience, knowledge, and commitment in this area. I concluded my intervention before the Human Rights Council with a recognition of the indigenous peoples, asking for forgiveness as a white man descended from the colonizing powers for the abuses and injustices committed, and expressing my gratitude for the example of dignity, perseverance, and wisdom that the indigenous peoples of the world have given us and continue to give us every day. Thank you very much.